Right in the middle of the party, my son forced me to kneel and apologize to his wife for upsetting her. I smiled and agreed. But when I stood up and spoke in front of the entire family, the words that came out of my mouth left the whole table in stunned silence, and my daughter-in-law nearly fell off her chair. I'm glad you're here. If you're watching this video, please hit like, subscribe to the channel, and tell me where you're listening to this story from. My name is Margaret. I've lived alone for many years. Most days, I find myself rearranging the picture frames on the shelf. Daniel at 7, wearing a helmet, his feet barely touching the ground but laughing wide on that red bicycle. My husband in uniform, back straight, eyes tilted slightly to the right as if someone just called his name. My hand lingers longer on that glass frame. I don't cry. Maybe I've grown too used to pain to cry anymore, or maybe I simply have no tears left. I carry the coffee tray to the table, absent-mindedly smoothing the tablecloth the way I do every morning. The phone buzzes. It's a video call from Daniel, the camera angle slightly tilted, the office light reflecting off his forehead. Busy day? I ask. Too many meetings, Mom. I'm up against a deadline. Can we move dinner to next week? His voice is rushed, but not annoyed. Behind him, the whiteboard is covered with scribbles and symbols I don't understand, but I can still recognize his handwriting slanted a bit to the right, just like it was in high school. Sure, next week's fine, I say, keeping my tone steady. Go take care of your work. I already made your favorite dish. He smiles. Save it for me. I'll come get it next week. Oh, Emily says hi. She wants to pick out curtains this weekend, so I'll have to tag along. All right, I reply. There's a pause before I add, I wanted to talk to you about... I stop. The coffee catches in my throat. About the washing machine. It's been making a strange noise. Daniel frowns, then chuckles softly. I'll take a look when I get a chance. I've got to jump into a meeting now. Eat something, okay? The call ends. The dark screen reflects my face. I stay there for a while, phone still in hand, eyes drifting toward the fogged-up window. Everything is in its proper place except for one thing I didn't say. I wanted to talk about the wedding. That's what I meant to say. My tongue had already formed the word wedding, but I swallowed it. I wanted to ask him about it, yet I couldn't bring myself to add more to his burden. I turn back to the shelf. His picture on the red bicycle is still there, holding a whole summer afternoon inside its frame. He'd kept pedaling around the yard while I stood on the porch with a towel in hand, calling out, "Don't look down, look straight ahead." He listened, and for the first time, he rode all the way to the gate, shouting, "I did it!" I remember that moment so clearly, as if I were watching my own younger self, small but stubborn, pushing through fear. Now, I want to tell him, don't look down, don't stare into the storm clouds gathering ahead. But I'm no longer on the porch. I'm standing alone in the kitchen, and the wind is stirring thoughts I can't quite name. The phone vibrates once an old message from Daniel pops up, the list of things he needed me to find so he could pick them up later. Outside the window, clouds roll in from the west, turning the sky to lead. I open the cabinet, gather the things he asked for the tin box, then put on my coat and grab my keys. Looking out at the sky, I realize it's raining again today, just like that night. And it all began, once more, with my son forgetting something. I remember that night because the rain was relentless, heavy, steady, and unending. 2 months before the wedding, Daniel had left some tax papers and warranty documents at my house. He texted, "Just keep them, Mom, I'll swing by this weekend." Then he forgot all about it. I gathered everything into a small tin box and decided to drive to his apartment before the rain got worse. Holding the box against my chest, I hurried into the lobby, wiped my coat with my hand, and pressed the elevator button. The fluorescent light reflected off the concrete ceiling, cold and even. When the doors opened on Daniel's floor, I stopped in front of apartment 312. Through the crack under the door, a thin beam of light stretched across the floor, not the kind that came from a timer. I lifted my hand to ring the bell, then froze an old habit from years of dropping by unannounced, listening first to see if anyone was home. Then came a woman's voice, uneven, low, drawn toward the door's surface. I took care of it," she said, trembling, her words falling like steps down a staircase. "Please, don't tell Daniel. I'm begging you. Keep it a secret, please." I recognized Emily's voice. My hand holding the box jerked slightly, the edge pressing into my rib cage. I couldn't hear whoever was on the other end, Only Emily pacing, her heels whispering against the wooden floor. No, it can't get out. It's done. Done. Don't call me again, please. A dry sound escaped my throat, rougher than the air from the vents. I gripped the handrail, my thumb digging into the cold metal edge. My breathing came in short bursts, like someone overexerting themselves. I'm not the kind of person who pries. I hate the idea of listening through walls. But those words, "Don't tell Daniel," forced me to do whatever it took to learn the truth, even if it meant doing something I despised. I stepped back slightly. The tin box brushed the wall with a muted thud. My other hand was already in my coat pocket before my mind even caught up. I unlocked my phone, my finger hovering over the voice recorder icon, not because I wanted proof to expose to the world. I just knew that, in the exact moment something felt wrong, a mother's instinct flipped a switch, self-protection, not curiosity. I slipped the phone halfway into my pocket, leaving the microphone exposed. My heart pounded like someone knocking from inside my chest. "All right, I'll call later," Emily said softly, her tone stretching with each slower step. "Just promise me you'll stay quiet. I can't lose everything right now." A pause, then breathing. Then the tone signaling the call had ended. I straightened, withdrew my hand from the doorbell, clutching the box tight against me like a life preserver in a pool. I didn't want to see anyone's face, least of all my own, reflected in theirs. I turned away. The hallway seemed to stretch longer with every step, the gray carpet soaking up raindrops dripping from my pant cuffs. The lobby downstairs felt colder than before. I stepped out onto the porch rain slanting sideways, wind slipping down my collar. I set the tin box on a bench, took out my phone, and stopped the recording. The screen showed a short, pale blue waveform resting quietly on a black background. I replayed a few seconds, just enough to know I hadn't imagined it. "I took care of it. Don't tell Daniel. Please keep it secret. No more details, no names." But that was more than enough to open a door I wished had stayed closed. Now came the hardest choice, to speak or to stay silent. If I spoke, I might destroy my son's wedding and the happiness he'd worked so hard to build. If I stayed silent, I'd have to live with the weight of the truth forever. I didn't drive straight home. I circled the city for what felt like hours, lost in thoughts and half-formed arguments, until finally, I made my choice. I would stay silent, not to protect anyone, not out of fear, but because some weddings need to run their course without being shattered halfway through. If the truth is meant to return, it will find its own way back. I wouldn't drag it out into this rain-soaked night. The private dining room on the second floor opened to the scent of polished wood and freshly uncorked wine. The white tablecloths were crisp, the silverware precisely aligned, the glassware forming small triangles on the tabletop. I sat at the far end. On either side were relatives from both families. At the head of the table sat Daniel and Emily. Daniel's co-workers, a few of Emily's friends' polite faces, all smiling the appropriate amount. When the appetizers arrived, Emily stood, wine glass in hand. She smiled, a smile everyone had come to know over the past 6 months. "Thank you all for being here," she said, her eyes sweeping across the table, pausing just long enough on her mother's face, then over the relatives. "The first 6 months of marriage? Well, they've been full of surprises." Laughter and nods of encouragement followed. She lowered her voice slightly. "I've learned how to cook the dishes Daniel likes, how to balance work and home, and how to be a daughter-in-law." That last phrase shifted the air slightly in my direction. She went on, "Sometimes I feel a little out of place. I know, not everyone accepts you right away." She set her glass down, her finger resting briefly on the rim. "But I believe we can all do better if there's just a bit more kindness between us." 2 of Emily's relatives seated to her left nodded at exactly the right moment. One murmured, "That's right." The other added, "That's what family is." Daniel took her hand under the table, a small gesture, but I saw it. One of Daniel's coworkers glanced at me for a second, then quickly looked away. I leaned back, folded my hands in my lap, my index finger tapping my thumb in a steady rhythm. I said nothing. Daniel stood. The chair scraped back with a brief, sharp sound. My son took a breath, his voice low but clear. "Tonight, I think it's time to put a few misunderstandings behind us." He looked at me not with challenge or pleading, but as someone looking at a door that needed to open. "Mom," he said, "if you could just say you're sorry, it would make things easier." The air in the room seemed to thin. The hum of the air conditioner sounded distant, like rain against a far wall. Someone tapped a spoon against a plate, then stopped. I could hear my heartbeat louder than any voice. In that moment, half a year played out in a single breath. I remembered giving Emily the seat by the window, staying silent when she rewrote the guest list, smiling when my chair was moved farther from the main table, cooking dinner and washing the dishes myself so as not to disrupt their schedule. I'd done everything to give them a peaceful start, kept what I'd heard that rainy night locked away, just so their wedding wouldn't go up in flames. I had stepped back as far as I could. But stepping back this far wasn't grace anymore, it was surrender. If Emily didn't know where the line was, if she wanted a stage on which I'd bow my head before everyone, then I would place the truth right on that stage. Not out of revenge, but because my son deserved a foundation that didn't sink. I pushed my chair back and stood, feeling the weight of it enough to remind myself I still had strength. The path between the chairs was narrow. I walked slowly, giving each head time to turn. The carpet was thick and soft, swallowing the sound of my steps. I stopped at the open space in the center of the table, where the light pooled brightest. My knees touched the carpet more gently than I expected. No one told me to kneel. I chose to kneel to draw every gaze to the center, to make clear. I had been silent to the very edge for their happiness, but before the truth was buried again, I would speak. "Emily," I said, looking straight at her. My voice was steady, not trembling. "I'm sorry." A few heads nodded. I saw Daniel's shoulders ease. Before anyone could exhale, I continued, "I'm sorry for keeping something I heard 2 months before your wedding." The words needed no embellishment. They went straight like a needle through cloth. Emily's expression changed almost instantly, as if someone had switched off the light inside her eyes. Her hand, which had been holding Daniel's, tightened, then slipped away. Daniel let go reflexively, glancing at her, then at me. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my phone. The glass felt cold. I opened the app and pressed play. Sound filled the room like clear water poured into a bowl. Emily's voice, unsteady but unmistakable. I took care of it. Please don't tell Daniel. I'm begging you. Keep it secret." A short pause. Then, "It can't come out. It's done before the wedding. Don't call again." I didn't explain. I didn't look around for validation. I let the recording do its work. When it stopped, I heard the clatter of a fork the aunt beside Emily had dropped hers. It rolled a short distance on the floor. One of Daniel's friends squinted up at the ceiling, as if trying to measure how far one could pretend this hadn't just happened. Emily's mother covered her mouth, her fingers trembling. And Emily, she was breathing hard, like someone who'd just climbed too many stairs. "That's old," she said quickly, words tumbling faster than usual. "It doesn't matter now. I tried." She turned to Daniel. "We're married now. What happened before?" Daniel said nothing. His eyes weren't angry, not loud, just retreating, as though realizing the path beneath him led nowhere. I stood, my knees still warm from the carpet. I placed the phone in the center of the table, beside the bread basket. "If anyone needs to hear it again," I said, "they can." I looked at Daniel. "If you want everything clear between us, this is my part." No one touched a glass for several long seconds. The waiter froze at the door, tray in hand, unsure whether to enter. Emily touched her neck, searching for a necklace that wasn't there. She inhaled, her voice barely above a whisper. "What are you doing?" I didn't answer. I wasn't doing anything, only putting one displaced thing back where it belonged, before it brought the whole shelf down. Daniel pushed his chair back. The scrape against the carpet sounded dry and final. He looked around the table, trying to gather all the eyes avoiding his. "I'm sorry," he said to the room, his voice rougher than I'd ever heard. "I need some air." He walked to the door. The noise of the restaurant rushed in and then cut off behind him. Emily half rose, then sat back down slowly, as if pulled by another gravity. Her relatives turned toward each other, searching for something, anything to patch the silence, now sitting over the dinner that was supposed to celebrate them. The parking lot shimmered under the yellow light, slick with rain, like fish scales glistening under glass. A cold draft rose off the concrete, carrying the mixed scent of gasoline and wet air. I stopped under the awning and held my breath. Daniel was leaning against his car, both hands braced on the roof, head bowed. Emily came running after him, her heels clacking, the hem of her dress brushing the dark puddles. "You have to listen to me," she said. her breath uneven. Listen to what? Daniel looked up, his voice hoarse, quiet. Why didn't you tell me before the wedding? Because I was scared. Emily wrapped her arms around herself, eyes downcast. I already took care of it. It's in the past. I don't want to lose us. The past doesn't erase itself, Daniel said. What do you want me to believe in? In the effort I've made these past 6 months, she replied quickly. In the way I've learned to live with your mother, with everything. Don't drag my mother into this, Daniel cut in. This is between you and me. 2 of Emily's relatives hurried out. One pulled her gently back, the other whispered to Daniel, calm down, you two can talk inside. Let us talk, Daniel said, turning toward them. His voice stayed low, but it hardened. Please. They exchanged glances, then stepped away. Emily moved closer. What do you want now? I want the truth, Daniel said, from start to finish. I already told you. She shook her head, voice breaking. It ended before the wedding. I didn't tell you because I was afraid you'd be angry. I've been trying to make things right. Then tell me his name, Daniel said. Where? When? Who were you saying don't call again to? Emily fell silent. The rain hit the car roof harder. After a long pause, she said softly, that doesn't matter anymore. It matters, Daniel said, this time without looking away. It matters because it's the foundation of everything we call trust. He exhaled. I'm tired. You're not going to leave me over something that's in the past, right? Emily grabbed his sleeve. We're married. Daniel pulled his arm free, not roughly, just slipping out of a rope. I don't answer questions with fear, he said. Tonight's over. He opened the car door, sat inside, and looked at her through the glass. We'll deal with it tomorrow. The door shut. Emily stood still in the rain for a moment, then turned toward the restaurant. Her relatives met her halfway, wrapping a coat over her shoulders, whispering something I couldn't hear. I stepped back into the shadows, gripping my coat to stop myself from saying some cheap word of comfort. Daniel's car pulled away, his red taillights stretching into long streaks across the wet pavement. I went back inside. One of my nieces ran up, her eyes wide and glistening. Auntie, are you okay? I'm fine, I said. Just that. She nodded and stepped back. My phone buzzed violently in my hand, messages flooding in. The family group chat. What just happened? Was that really necessary? You two are turning a family memory into an awkward scene. Someone asked for the recording. Someone else said I'd gone for drama. I stared at the screen for a while, then typed, tonight, everyone heard enough. Send. No exclamation mark. No argument. I silenced the phone, slipped it into my pocket, and walked out through the side door that led back down to the parking lot. The house greeted me with the soft click of the lock. I turned on the living room light. The warm glow spread across the wooden floor. The scent of old wood and the faint trace of morning coffee lingered. I hung up my coat, washed my hands longer than usual, the hot water reddening my skin. I walked to the photo shelf. The wedding picture of Daniel and Emily stood in the center, the silver frame gleaming. They were smiling beneath an arch of flowers. I took the frame off the nail and set it on the table. This wasn't an act of punishment. It was simply something that needed to be done. I unlatched the back, removed the photo, slipped it into a white envelope, and slid it into the third drawer, the one where I keep things that don't yet have a place. I didn't tear it up. Tearing is denial. And I don't deny what's already lived. The phone lit up on the table. Daniel's name. I touched the screen, but the call ended before I could answer. A heartbeat later, a message came through. I'll come by tomorrow, just you and me. I let the screen stay lit until it went dark on its own, like watching a window across the street go dim. I didn't reply right away. Tomorrow, Daniel will come. We'll lay the questions on the table, ones that can't be avoided anymore. I won't promise myself that everything will be fine. I'll only promise to let him speak first. When I opened my eyes that morning, I heard the street washing truck moving slowly past, like someone cleaning up backstage after a ruined performance. The phone on the kitchen table kept blinking. Messages had piled up. Relatives from the other side asking for the audio file. A cousin advising me to send another apology to keep the peace. An uncle declaring, private matters should stay behind closed doors. One of Daniel's friends had sent a thumbs-up emoji with the comment, "You handled that like a boss, ma'am." I read them all, no sighing, no quickened breath. I poured my coffee and set the phone face down. The rule was simple. Yesterday was enough. I wouldn't send another word, another explanation, another line that would breed more argument. Silence isn't escape, it's the lid you put on a boiling pot. I cleared the table, put the knives and forks in their proper drawer, and wiped the counter vertically, a small ritual that gives the mind something to hold on to. Then the doorbell rang. Daniel stood outside in a gray hoodie, hood pulled low, eyes shadowed like someone who hadn't slept in days. He hugged me quickly, not tight, but long enough for the smell of last night's rain to fade into the clean scent of his clothes. "Have you eaten?" I asked. "Too much coffee already," he said with a weary smile, sitting down. His chin sank into his interlaced fingers, knuckles pale. "Then toast," I said, turning on the oven. "It's easy on the stomach." He watched my movements the way one watches a wall clock, just to keep time. When the toast popped up, Daniel spoke, softly but clearly. "When did you first hear about it?" "The rainy night, 2 months before the wedding," I said, setting the plate before him. "In the hallway." "That's all, Mom?" he asked. "That's all." I didn't elaborate, didn't put words in anyone's mouth. I started recording the moment I realized something was off. Daniel nodded slightly, as if marking a point on a map. "I need to hear it," he said. I handed him the phone, the file already open. He pulled his chair closer, placed both hands on the table, and listened start to finish, uninterrupted. When it ended, the kitchen was so still we could hear the heater click on and off. Daniel leaned back, gazing through the window at the thin stretch of clouds over the neighbor's roof. Minutes passed without a word. I let them. "I thought I'd be furious," he said at last, "but all that's left now is emptiness." He pressed his forehead against his hands, inhaled, exhaled. "I thought I'd seen clearly. Turns out I only believed because I needed to." I pushed the plate of toast aside, poured him a fresh glass of warm water. "Drink," I said. He sipped in small, deliberate swallows, like someone reminding his body it could still obey. "I need you to do something for me," he said. "Don't share this with anyone. Don't send the file. Don't tell the story again. Let me handle it." "All right," I nodded. "I've done my part. The rest is yours." He took off his hood, twisting the fabric between his fingers. "I'll check her accounts, call logs, emails, the little things I overlooked before. Then I'll talk to Emily privately. No circles, no delays." I laid my hand on the table, not touching his, just close. "Don't make decisions in anger," I said, "but don't accept what you know is wrong." Daniel gave a tired smile. "That sounds like an equation," he said, "and the only result is honesty." He stood, walked around the counter, and hugged me again, longer this time. "Thank you for not saying anything before the wedding," he murmured. "And thank you for saying it last night." When the door closed behind him, I stood there for a while, my hand resting on the edge of the table where he'd leaned. The phone vibrated. Emily's best friend's name appeared on the screen. I hesitated a second, then answered. "Hello, Mrs. Margaret." The woman's voice was soft but sharp underneath. "I'm sure you know I'm Emily's close friend. I just want to understand what happened last night." "Emily said you trapped her, recorded her, then waited for the right moment to humiliate her." "Did she say exactly how she was trapped?" I asked. "Well, she said you were eavesdropping, and then—" "I won't comment," I cut in politely. "Everyone heard what needed to be heard. The rest is for them to resolve." The other line went quiet for a few seconds. "But don't you think that was a bit cruel?" "Cruel is a wide word," I said. "Last night, I simply put something back where it belonged." "All right," she said, exhaling. "I understand." Her voice didn't sound convinced, but it wasn't combative anymore. "Anyway, I hope things calm down." "Don't we all?" I said. I hung up and switched the phone to silent. More messages appeared. A cousin offering, "Want me to talk to them for you?" An aunt concluding, "Women just can't get along." I didn't respond. I put on my shoes and walked around the neighborhood. The morning air was drying out. The clouds were being pushed toward the bay. On the sidewalk, a boy carried a skateboard, tugging his hood up, yelling to his friend, "Hurry up." That sound reminded me of Daniel's voice when he was small. I counted my steps, grounding my mind back into my body. Heel, toe, heel, toe. By the time I returned home, my head felt half a pound lighter. The next evening, Daniel texted, "I'm talking to Emily tonight." I replied, "All right," and set the phone face down on the table, trying not to look at the clock. When he called back later, his voice was low and steady, like he was reading from a list. I asked everything in order. No small talk. The apartment was quiet, the yellow light dim, the ceiling fan turning slowly. I need a timeline, Daniel told Emily. That rainy night, 2 months before the wedding. Who did you call? Emily leaned against the kitchen counter, twirling a strand of hair. You know how stressful it was before the wedding family work? Daniel interrupted. What's his name? Emily moved around, opened a cabinet, closed it, started talking about the dress, the budget running over, her mother wanting a bigger venue. The reason you hid it? Daniel asked. Because I was scared, Emily said. Scared you'd leave. Daniel told her to grab a notebook, to write down every incomplete answer. When, where, who. For every time she dodged, he made a mark. The more she talked, he told me later, the bigger the blanks became. I just kept feeling like I was walking across a bridge with missing steps. They went quiet for a while. Daniel pushed his chair back, leaning against the wall. You have a chance to be clear. Now. Emily looked up, lips pressed together. I ended it before the wedding, she said, avoiding his eyes. It's over. Don't ask for details. It'll only make things worse. Daniel didn't raise his voice. He just set his pen down. Things are worse because there are no details. The next morning, Daniel took half a day off work. I need to look at some papers, he said. I didn't ask. He went to the bank, printed out his card statements from the 3 months before the wedding, cross-checked the dates and charges, nothing complicated, just ran a ruler over the lines with unusually high expenses and clipped them aside. Back home, he pulled an old phone out of a storage box, charged it, powered it on, scrolled through the call log. Long calls to an unsaved number, scattered over the final 2 weeks before the wedding. In their shared email account, meant for home planning, he found a few booking confirmations, short-term hotel meeting rooms, a few hours each, twice in 1 week. Each piece alone is nothing, Daniel said to me, but together they make a picture, and that picture fits the words, I took care of it, from the recording. That night, he met Emily at a quiet cafe by the lake. The bar lights were low, music soft, few customers. Daniel told me later, I said I wanted the truth, not the version that sounds nice. Emily traced the edge of her spoon, the reflection of the bartender polishing glasses flickering in her eyes. I made mistakes before the wedding, she said, her voice sliding over the table like over smooth glass. But it's over. I've tried these past 6 months. We can't destroy everything because of what's already gone. Daniel didn't answer right away. He turned his coffee cup slowly, watching the foam spin. The past is the foundation of what we have, he said. If the foundation's cracked, the house sinks. Emily leaned forward. So what do you want? A list? You want a name just so we can torture each other with it? I want to know what I'm standing on, Daniel said. The conversation ended in a long silence. I was the first to stand up, Daniel said. I paid, said goodbye politely, then went outside and took a deep breath. I knew whatever came next wasn't going to happen at that table. Later that night, Daniel came over. He didn't cry. I'm tired, he said. I opened the fridge, took out some cold cuts, cheese, and cucumber, arranged them on a plate, poured him a glass of water. We sat across from each other at the kitchen table like all those times years ago when we'd fixed his bike together and a stubborn bolt refused to turn. Daniel spoke plainly, no emotion padding his words. I let the utensils touch softly now and then, as if to keep time so the story wouldn't move too fast. I don't want you sending that recording to anyone else, he said. No comments, no expanding the circle. I nodded. I've done my part. I'll stop here. The next day, Daniel called a counseling center a coworker had recommended. After a few difficult calls, he found an open slot Wednesday afternoons. I need someone outside the family, he said. I congratulated him the way one congratulates a patient after a successful first surgery. That afternoon, he met with a family lawyer in a downtown office. No complicated terms in his retelling, just neat lines on paper, options, steps, things to avoid, things to document. They said I have the right to leave the marriage if trust can't be restored, Daniel said. No one's forcing me to be a hero. When he got home, he opened an old suitcase. I sat on the kitchen step, listening to the zipper run. He folded a few shirts, packed some books and toiletries into a bag. I'm renting a place near the park, he said. Month to month. Nothing long-term. "I just need space." I nodded. I didn't ask him to stay. I didn't put my arm around his shoulders like when he was 12. I just went to the living room, opened a drawer, and took out an old keychain my husband used to carry, a small compass. I placed it in Daniel's hand. "Take it. When you feel lost, it'll help you find your way." He looked at the little compass, smiled tiredly. I know. By the time Daniel rolled his suitcase to the door, the wind had picked up. Leaves in the yard turned their pale sides up. He turned back. "Mom," he said, "thank you for not pushing me in any direction. I'll find my own." I nodded and opened the door. The suitcase wheels bumped against the wooden steps, dry and firm. I stood on the porch until his taillights disappeared at the corner. Inside, I realized my hand was clenched so tight the imprint of the compass keychain was pressed into my palm. That night, I laid a small cloth on the kitchen table and set my phone down in the center, silent. One truth had led to another, each piece fitting into place. It didn't shout. It just stood where it belonged. And when my son chose to leave, not to run, but to see more clearly, I knew we had finally set the first stone of a new bridge. Less beautiful than that wedding day, but solid. I turned off the lights, leaving only the porch lamp on. Outside, the wind brushed the little wind chime, the metal pieces touching each other with a soft, perfect sound, two fragments finally aligned. Then the days just kept passing. No more shocks, no more calls, and the curious messages asking for updates slowly faded away. Maybe the relatives had started to forget. But one morning, as I set the coffee pot on the stove, Daniel texted, "I just signed." Half an hour later, he stopped by, carrying a thin folder. We sat at the kitchen table. The white paper lay between us, the sound of the stapler marking a kind of final punctuation. Daniel read it one last time, drew a clean line with his pen, no bowed head, no trembling hand. 2 days later, they met at the mediation office, a glass-walled room overlooking the street. The mediator sat in the middle, voice neutral. "Each party, please keep it brief." Daniel chose his words carefully. "I need transparency and accountability for what's been done." Emily rubbed her hands together, eyes red. "I was under pressure. I tried. Whatever happened before the wedding is over. We can move on, start again." The mediator asked, "What exactly does start again mean to you?" Emily looked down. "To continue the marriage." Without digging things up, Daniel answered, "Without trust as the foundation, any continuing is temporary." The whole session circled around those two words, foundation and forgetting, as if they were opposite ends of a rope. In the end, the report read, "No agreement reached." The next meeting was postponed. Daniel left first, waiting for the elevator, staring at the stream of people below, as though looking at a river with no shore for him to stand on. I called him that afternoon. "Are you all right?" "I'm all right," he said, "in the sense that I know I have to keep going." In our circles, the whispers began. A few of Emily's friends posted cryptic comments. "Sometimes women treat each other worse than men do. Don't believe everything you hear. Shame on adults who should know better." Some added laughing emojis. Some tagged each other. I only saw it because a niece sent me a screenshot. I didn't respond. Daniel stayed silent. I stayed silent. The audio file still rested quietly in my phone, unsent, uncommented. Without new details, rumors tire quickly. People moved on to talk about some strange voicemail, a new movie, the weekend games. The noise dissipated like cigarette smoke in a backyard. At Emily's design firm, pressure arrived in the usual professional way. Delayed deadlines, clients asking for revisions for the third time, cold feedback calls. No one mentioned her private life in meetings, just Gantt charts and red milestones. When asked why her schedule had slipped, Emily said she was making adjustments, but her voice dropped on the last syllable. That night, she texted a few relatives saying she'd been set up, and the recording was edited. But when they asked for details, she got trapped behind two words: "Don't ask." On a rainy afternoon, she sent an email requesting a short medical leave. I saw the notification by accident, forwarded to an old group thread. I closed it. It wasn't my place. Daniel began clearing the path out of Seattle. He applied for an internal transfer, choosing Denver the way someone chooses a closer Sunday. The approval came faster than expected. His move date was set for early next month. The news spread among his friends like a breeze. Some came over that weekend with boxes, tape, and markers. They hugged him one by one, the smell of sweat and packing tape mixing with the scent of new cardboard. I arrived late, carrying a bag of butter cookies. Daniel's apartment looked like a folded-up map, empty bookshelves, stacks of labeled boxes along the wall, kitchen, bedroom, documents. His oldest friend opened a cable box and joked dryly, "When you get to Denver, you better switch teams." Daniel laughed, a measured, easy laugh. "We'll see," he said. We took down the curtains, rolled them up, unscrewed the small hooks from the wall. The screwdriver whined softly. I wiped the faint circle left by an old frame like cleaning a small grease stain from a white shirt. Daniel gathered loose papers into a bag, then looked around the nearly empty room, the way one looks at a shoulder they've leaned on for years. With the door closed, only the two of us remained. Standing in the center of the living room, hands in his pockets, Daniel said, "I used to dream of moving for an opportunity. Now I'm moving because of a choice." "Opportunity or choice," I said. "Either way, you'll need steady footing." On the day he returned the keys, Daniel wiped the kitchen counters, swept under the bed, checked every cabinet. I carried out the trash, came back, and found him standing at the front door a beat longer than a breath. He took the old key off the compass keychain, set it on the counter, snapped a photo, and sent it to the landlord with the note. Left the key on the counter, no farewell ceremony, just the sound of footsteps echoing down a long hallway and the soft close of the elevator door. Outside, the sky was heavy with clouds, but held its rain. We drove the boxes to a storage unit. The car was weighted down, the shocks groaning each time we hit a bump. "I don't know when I'll feel lighter," Daniel said. "Keep going," I answered. "You'll know when you do." That evening, he stayed at my house. I laid fresh sheets in the upstairs room, set a reading lamp by the bed, left a glass of water on the nightstand. Daniel stood at the doorway, looking into the room that had been his in high school, the newly painted white walls, the rearranged bookshelves, but the west-facing window still the same. "There's always a bed here," I said, "but I won't keep you locked in it." He leaned against the doorframe, smiling faintly. "I know." Before bed, I stood on the porch. The night wind brushed my cheek like a cold hand. From somewhere beyond the bay came the distant sound of a train whistle. I thought about the paper that morning on the kitchen table, the blue ink, Daniel's signature, a bridge between the old shore and the new one. The private matter had entered the legal tracks now. There would be dates, meetings, case numbers, but the silence remained the hardest part. No defamation, no justification, no explanations, even when the heart still wanted to speak. I wrapped my arms around myself and took a deep breath. We had chosen to stand firmly on the ground that was real. The rest would unfold, right on schedule. A few days later, Daniel sent me a photo taken from his balcony, the sky dry and blue, the mountains in the distance soft as a gentle wall, sunlight slanting across the wooden floor. "Here's the apartment," he wrote. I tapped the video call. He turned the phone slowly. A modest, square living room, bright walls, a new bookshelf still carrying the scent of fresh wood, a small cactus by the window like a nail pinning sunlight in place. "I'm keeping things minimal," he said, opening the kitchen cabinet so I could see a few pots, 3 bowls, 2 glasses. I nodded. "That's enough." On his first day, he jogged along the park near his building, sending me a picture of the sandy trail lined with trees and an old man walking a dog in the opposite direction. "I'm not running fast," he smiled, "but I'm steady." In the evenings, he cooked for himself. I watched him dice onions, his hands sure and precise, and remembered how, as a boy, he'd hunch over the cutting board like he was reading a book. "Don't forget to wash the board right after," I reminded him. "I know," he said. His new rhythm fit him like a well-tailored shirt. Morning runs, work days, quiet dinners, lights out early. The unfocused look in his eyes, the one that had lingered for months, was fading, layer by layer. Work found its footing, too. Daniel joined a new project with the technical team. I didn't understand all the jargon, only that he said the handover had been rough going because the last person had left it half finished. "But I'm catching up," he said, his voice like a nail tapping into wood. At the monthly meeting, his manager praised the progress. Daniel texted me a single word: "Good." I felt a calm satisfaction, like putting a book back on the right shelf without needing to read the cover to know where it belonged. Sunday evenings became our new ritual. Each of us with a warm drink, me in the kitchen under yellow light, him on the sofa beside the cactus. We didn't talk about Emily, not out of avoidance, but because that chapter no longer belonged at the table. I told him about the soup I'd made for the seniors at the community center. An older black woman had said, "This tastes like winter." He told me about a squirrel on his running path that liked to crouch on a tree trunk before darting out, nearly tripping him. "Have you switched football teams yet?" I teased. He shrugged, still deciding. We traded books. I was reading a short novel. He, a nonfiction about habits. Our mother, son, rhythm had become like learning to read again. One word, one line at a time. No interruptions, no speaking for the other, respecting the pauses. Seattle still alternated between rain and sun, like someone who changes their mind often but means no harm. I stayed, learning how to fill the space without stuffing it. One morning, I walked into the community center in the North End. The storage room smelled of paper and fabric, shelves stacked with donation boxes. I sorted clothes by size, labeled canned goods. Simple work, but meaningful, because it kept things moving. On Wednesdays, I taught a small cooking class for seniors. Oven-roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, gravy made from the drippings. I showed them how to test thickness with a wooden spoon, how to season until the salt doesn't stand alone. They laughed, told me stories about their grandchildren. Somewhere along the way, my laughter had rounded out again. One afternoon, I ran into the center's director in the hallway. "Are you free this weekend?" she asked. "We could use an extra hand distributing meals." I nodded. I found myself thinking less about that old dinner party. It had softened into a lesson on the altitude of truth. I hadn't become saintly. I just noticed my shoulders relaxing, my arms less tense. At night, I slept more deeply. Each morning, I have a small ritual. I set my husband's photo beside a scented candle and pour 2 cups of tea, one for me, one for the one who's gone. I speak a few short lines. "The sky's clear today. The maples out front are turning red. Daniel in Denver ran another lap." I blow out the candle before leaving. It isn't religion, just a thread to keep the house steady when the wind changes. When I lock the door, I still whisper, "Watch the house for me," though I know no one answers. One Sunday evening, the screen came on. Daniel had set his phone on the windowsill to let me visit his place. His hands were still wet from washing dishes. "I added a small shelf for the cactus," he said, turning the camera. Outside, the horizon was dusky purple, windows across the street lighting up one by one. "Have you found a decent coffee shop yet?" I asked. "There's a good one on the corner," he said, smiling. "The barista already remembers my name." I heard my own kettle whistle, lifted it off the stove. "Do you miss Seattle?" I asked, not to pull him back, just to measure the length of the cord between us. "I miss the rain," he said. "The smell of wet wood." Then after a pause, "But the sunlight here wakes me up." I nodded. We need both the rain to know we can endure and the sun to remind us we're still alive. The next week, he told me about a snag in his project: corrupted data holding up a task. He described it simply, without jargon. "This part doesn't match that part." After some tough work, the team fixed it and delivered on time. "My boss sent an email," Daniel said, showing me his screen. It read only, "Good job." I smiled. "Sometimes 2 words are enough," he shrugged. That and a long nap. At the center, I recruited 2 more helpers for the cooking class. A retired truck driver who diced onions better than I expected, and a thin, quick-handed woman who broke bread into even pieces. When everyone finished eating, someone touched my hand and said, "Thank you for the warmth." When I got home, I opened the mailbox, a postcard from Daniel. A photo of the mountains, with only one line on the back. "Mom, I'm still running." I pinned it on the shelf between my husband's photo and the old compass keychain. That evening, I went out to water the garden. Dusk deepened, porch lights blinked on across the street. From somewhere, children called to one another. A ball bounced steadily along the concrete path. That night, I dreamed a simple dream. I was standing on a bridge, looking down at the water, watching a tin box float past, drifting, not sinking, not turning back. I didn't reach for it. In the morning, I made tea, set out 2 cups as always, and lit the candle. "Our son's doing all right today," I said to the photograph. The flame flickered once, then stood steady. I blew it out, picked up my bag, and locked the door behind me. Ahead, the new day promised nothing special, but I felt ready. In Denver, Daniel opened his apartment door. Sunlight filtered through the trees, stretching across the floor in a long golden stripe like a road. I knew he'd follow that light all day, not rushing, not looking back to see whether the shadows were still chasing him. His breathing was steady again, so was mine. Late in the afternoon, sunlight filtered through the vines on the porch, warm enough for me to pull a wooden chair outside. I set the stack of papers on my lap, the dark pen resting on the edge of the page. "To the Margaret I used to be," I wrote. The first letter trembled, then steadied. I told myself the story of kneeling in the middle of that banquet hall, the carpet so soft my knees seemed to sink into it, the smell of wine and wood mingling in the air, the eyes of relatives sweeping across my face like dull knives. I could see my own hand resting on my lap, my mind cold and sharply clear. I had been weak in form, lower than every chair around me, but strong in the one place that mattered. I had set the truth on the table, where it belonged. I told my old self, "No one teaches you how to kneel properly. You figure out the right height on your own, high enough to look someone in the eye without shouting." I kept writing. The feeling after standing up wasn't light. It was heavy, the kind of weight you feel after lifting a box off your back. But strangely, that heaviness had direction. I told of the night leaving the restaurant, the parking lot glimmering gold like fish scales, Daniel leaning against the car, Emily running after him, their words colliding and falling. I had stood beneath the awning, gripping the edge of my coat, silent as a button. I didn't interfere. I simply held my place, the person who opened the door for truth to enter, then stepped aside. "I know I wronged my old self," I wrote. "Wrong for staying silent too long." But then I loosened that knot with the reason. I hadn't wanted to steal a wedding. I believed that sometimes the truth must choose its most brutal moment to exist when there's no other way. I looked down at my hands, the blue veins visible under sunlight. The pen moved. Forgiveness isn't erasing, it's resetting. I paused to listen, the neighbor's car door closing, a bird hopping across the fence, the sound punctuating my last sentence. Turning the page, I wrote, "I was more afraid of losing my son than of being judged." The sentence fell like a pebble into water, clean and deep. I lingered over the period. I remembered my husband's voice back in our old kitchen, the smell of fried onions and his rain-wet coat. "We don't lie to make someone stay." That line came back now like a rope, pulling me out of the mud of guilt. I wrote, "The dinner party was my limit. If I'd stayed silent any longer, that silence wouldn't have been love. It would have been collusion." I folded the paper lightly, the dry rustle sounding like leaves brushing against each other. Then I folded the letter in thirds, slipped it into an envelope, tied a thin string around it. I took a small shovel out to the backyard and chose a spot beneath a young tree that had survived every winter so far. The soil was damp, the blade of the shovel sliding through with a soft scrape. I dug a shallow hollow, placed the envelope inside. "Stay here," I whispered like to a child who'd just fallen asleep. I filled the hole, smoothed the earth with the back of the shovel, scattered a handful of dry leaves over it. No ceremony, just the right motion. I stood, wiped my hands on my pants, inhaled the smell of fresh soil, unexpectedly calm. Something inside my chest had shifted, no longer pressing against my breath. My phone buzzed in my pocket. Daniel was calling on video. The frame tilted as he walked from the kitchen to the balcony. In Denver, the late afternoon shadows stretched long. "Mom, let me tell you something," he said with a small smile, setting the phone on the railing. "There's a new coworker who just joined our team. She's kind, reminds everyone to drink water, sends files on time, speaks her mind." I noticed how carefully he chose his words, without rushing. "Not in a hurry," Daniel added quickly. "I just feel at ease talking to her." I nodded, smiling. "Take it slow, learn well, no need to rush." He nodded back, a faint relief crossing his face, like someone realizing it's okay to move at their own pace. "Were you doing something in the yard?" he asked. "I buried a letter," I said, "to my old self." Daniel was quiet for a beat, then said softly, "Sounds like it was time." We moved on to dinner. He was having grilled fish with vegetables. I was making soup. We left our phones on the table, eating while swapping small stories, the squirrel darting across his running path again, the coffee shop on the corner changing their beans, an old woman at the community center bringing a postcard with an orange flower. In the middle of our conversation, I said, "Hey, let's make a deal, you and I." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "One shared meal every week in person, if possible. Video, if not," I said. "And we don't revisit old wounds unless we have to." "Deal," he said, smiling, raising his water glass as if to toast. "One more thing, if there's something hard to say, we warn each other with one line, no dancing around it." "Agreed," I said, My line will be, "My hands are shaking." Daniel laughed. And mine's, "I'm afraid I'll say it wrong." We wrote both lines on sticky notes and posted them on our refrigerators. When the call ended, I kept the screen lit for a few seconds longer, as if holding the door open for the wind to pass through. Inside, the house glowed with soft yellow light. A few breadcrumbs were left on the table. I stepped back onto the porch, sat in the same chair, and looked out at the garden, now holding a new secret beneath its soil. I no longer replayed the words from that night or the faces in the room. The wedding photo in the drawer stayed still. The letter beneath the tree stayed still. Neither demanded an answer from me anymore. Night came slowly, like a familiar friend who knew the way, no loud knocking, just arriving. I went into the kitchen, brewed 2 cups of tea, set my husband's photo beside the candle, whispered a few lines about the day. The flame flickered once, then stood steady. I blew it out, washed the cups, hung the towel over the chair. Before turning off the lights, I added one more line beneath the note on the fridge. "It's my turn to cook this Sunday." A single period. Enough. I knew the new shape of our relationship had settled, not clinging out of fear, not parting out of pride. Just 2 people walking in rhythm, knowing when to speak and when to stay quiet. In Denver, Daniel was probably drawing his curtains, setting down his book, letting the cactus lean toward the moonlight. In Seattle, the wind brushed the porch, lifting the scent of soil from where the letter rested. I wished my old self a peaceful sleep, then stepped inside, leaving the future to stand guard outside like a gentle dog. Silent, but always listening to the sound of my footsteps. I landed in Denver at noon, under a clear Sunday. The air was dry and crisp, the cold wind brushing my skin like a deliberate touch to keep me awake. Daniel met me at the arrival gate, pulled me into a firm hug. The scent of fresh laundry on his shirt felt like home. We didn't talk much in the car. The city unfolded in wide roads and low buildings, the mountains on the horizon faint but steady, like a gentle wall. His apartment was tidy, light wooden floors, the cactus sitting exactly where it should, a few new book spines on the shelf. Sunlight stretched across the floor and stopped at the pair of slippers I'd just taken off. "I thought we'd cook at home," Daniel said, opening the fridge. I hung up my coat and rolled up my sleeves. "I'll make the sauce," I said. We laid out the dishes my husband used to love: seared meat, mashed potatoes, quick sautéed greens. Daniel mashed the potatoes, his grip steady. I stirred the pan drippings with a wooden spoon until they thickened, tasted the edge of the spoon, and added a pinch of salt. The small kitchen grew warm, steam fogging the window glass, the smell of butter and black pepper curling into the corners. We didn't talk about the past, but we didn't avoid it either. Once, Daniel pointed to the pot on the stove and said, "Dad used to say not to cover it at this stage." I nodded. "Right, let it absorb on its own." When we sat down at the table, 2 plates, 2 sets of silverware, I lifted my glass of water and said softly, "Happy birthday." He smiled, eyes narrowing slightly, no longer shadowed with fatigue. That afternoon, we washed dishes, wiped down the counters, and left everything as clean as when we'd started. Daniel brought out a small box from the living room. "A gift," he said, setting it in front of me. Inside was a plain wooden photo frame, empty. "Pick a moment that deserves to be in it," he said. I turned the frame in my hands, feeling the smooth grain, the faint scent of varnish. "I already know what to put in," I told him, not aloud, but clear enough. I'd place a picture with no strained smiles. Maybe the one I took that morning, our shadows overlapping in the strip of sunlight on the floor. Just 2. No more, no less. Then I reached into my bag and took out my gift for him. My husband's old keychain, shaped like a compass. I placed it in Daniel's palm. "Keep it," I said, "to remember which doors to open. And if you ever get lost, just stand still for a minute." He smiled, running a thumb over the worn metal. "I will," he said. We sat quietly for a while, words unnecessary. The light dimmed, street lamps blinked on. Daniel glanced at his phone. A faint notification flashed. He frowned for a second, then turned the screen toward me. A short message hovered at the top. "I'm sorry for everything, Emily." Daniel didn't touch it. He waited a beat, then swiped to delete. No shaking hands, no hesitation. I looked at him and said nothing. An old door had closed without a sound. In my mind, I heard the latch click firm, not heavy. That evening, I took my coat out to the balcony. The air was colder now, but the sky was wide open. The mountains in the distance looked like a charcoal line, steady, grounded. Daniel stood beside me, holding a mug of hot tea. We leaned against the railing, not looking at each other, both gazing toward the horizon. Down below, cars moved in rhythm, a steady pulse through the city. The wind brushed our hair, cold enough to keep us alert. From here, looking west, Daniel said, you can always see the mountains. Good, I answered. Gives you something to measure distance by. I thought of the past months, the dinner party, the kneeling, the recording. All of it had shrunk into small stones paving a path, no longer blocking it. I didn't feel triumphant. I just felt my body standing straight, not tense, just right. I said softly, half to the wind, half to myself. Sometimes they make you kneel to silence you. But once truth stands tall, no one can keep the chair of lies. Daniel turned to me but didn't ask who I meant. He only nodded, his eyes calm and long in their peace. Below us, the car lights ran together like a thread across the city's fabric. Up here, we stood still, finishing our tea, listening to the faint chime of the metal wind bell. Night spread over the apartment like a thin blanket. We slid the doors shut, tidied a few things, dimmed the lights. Before bed, I paused by the cactus near the window, the distant streetlight catching on its tiny spines like dots of ink. I thought of the empty frame still in its box, the compass now in Daniel's pocket, and the deleted message. The three of them aligned quietly, the past with its place, the present with something to hold, the future with a thread to sew by. At dawn, Daniel touched my shoulder to wake me. Come out to the balcony, he whispered, careful not to wake the neighbors. The air was thin, the wind threading through. The mountains stood sharp, their edges honed overnight. The sky blushed pale pink near the clouds, a narrow line of light spreading wider. We stood there, cups in hand, breath visible in the cold. A bird swooped by, its shadow cutting across the light before vanishing behind the roof across the street. First day of a new age, I said. Daniel laughed. Sounds like a song title. No, I said, just something worth writing on the first page. I lifted my phone and took a photo, 2 silhouettes and 1 horizon line. This will go in the frame, I said. Daniel nodded. It deserves to. We went back inside, made breakfast, poached eggs and toast. Butter hissed on the pan. I poured 2 glasses of water, set the salt and pepper in their place. Daniel placed the compass on the table, a small token of an unspoken promise. After we ate, I cleaned up while he took the trash out. I looked around his apartment, nothing extra, nothing missing. In my head, a closing line appeared, quiet and straight as a drawn line. Victory isn't loud, it's simply living right. I tucked that sentence away, in the place where I keep the words worth returning to, not to boast, but to remember which door to open when the wind changes. The story you've just heard is fictional, but every glance, every choice, every moment of silence from that woman was carved from a truth most people don't dare face. Sometimes, to hold on to what's right, you have to sacrifice what you love most. Not out of hatred, but out of honesty, the kind of love that's grown up enough to understand that hiding the truth is just another form of betrayal. Names and details have been changed to protect the identities of those who might be recognized. We didn't tell this story to glorify revenge, but to remind you that there are mothers people once called cold, who chose to rebuild trust 1 brick at a time. Not with tears, but with resolve and respect for the truth. If you've ever had to say something that broke your own heart just to prevent a deeper fracture, if you've ever been called cruel simply because you refused to accept a lie, remember this: that isn't cruelty. It's the courage of someone willing to bear the weight of responsibility. Leave a comment if you've ever chosen truth over comfort, and if you believe that justice isn't a scream, but the quiet click of a door finally closing where it should share this video. Somewhere out there, someone might need a reason to stand tall again, to learn how to live honestly once more. Don't forget to subscribe, because here, every story is a precise incision, cutting through deceit, laying open the wounds, stitching trust back together, so the heart can learn to beat steady again, not from hatred, but from truth. On the final screen, we're sharing 2 more stories about people who lost everything just to preserve the one thing still intact, their dignity. Trust me, you won't just watch. You'll feel every heartbeat, as if you were the one standing in that room, choosing to tell the truth.